Well, welcome. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Robert Hutchings, the Dean of the LBJ School, and it is my great honor and privilege to introduce our speaker this evening. You know that Senator Lugar was a six-term U.S. Senator, twice chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and for many years the ranking Republican on the committee. You also know about his signature legislative achievement, the Nunn-Lugar Act, which has resulted in the deactivation of more than 7,600 nuclear warheads that were once targeted on the United States. I feel a little safer already. You may know that he was the longest serving member of Congress in Indiana history, serving also as chairman of the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. You may not know that he was an Eagle Scout, a Rhodes Scholar, a U.S. naval officer, and a farmer, actually still is a farmer, and that he was elected mayor of Indianapolis at age 35, serving 2 terms before being elected to the Senate. He currently serves as president of the Lugar Center and as professor of practice and distinguished scholar at Indiana University. In March, he was awarded the Knight of the British Empire. Last month, President Obama named Richard Lugar a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. To those of us who worked in Washington during Senator Lugar's long tenure, he is known, admired, and respected for his deep knowledge of foreign affairs, and also for his unshakable integrity, courtesy, and bipartisanship. It is a great personal as well as a professional honor to introduce this evening's distinguished speaker, the Honorable Richard Lugar.
Thank you very much. Well, what a great opportunity this is for me to be with so many students who aspire to public service, who are looking forward to the challenges of those opportunities, and I think will be rewarded in terms of your own personal satisfaction, as well as watching at least the advances of the people that you serve. I would just say that I'm excited also by the introduction of the Dean, because it reminds me of at least an event that occurred at the British Embassy, which I received knighthood. It was conferred by Queen Elizabeth, and the most exciting aspect was Shar, my wife, and me seeing our grandchildren and all the ways in which they enjoyed that award, being right in the middle of all of it. They were, in fact, the designees. I want to mention specifically that as I sat down this evening, I was with the Grahams. Professor Graham made a big difference in terms of this campus, as well as public service, as well as his beautiful wife, Jane. And they are the parents of Catherine Graham, who is wife now of David Lugar, and she heads the Hotel Association of America. Has had quite a career of her own, but very, very exciting family, and we're grateful for them. And let me have just the point of personal privilege in mentioning I saw Bob Inman and Nancy at lunch, but the Admiral is a very special person in my life because we had the privilege of serving under Admiral Arleigh Burke when he was Chief of Naval Operations. I had the benefit of a Rhodes Scholarship, and as I finished up that scholarship, as I think many of you would have done, had you had the experiences I had for the first time of going overseas. Many of you have been back and forth a good number of times, but discovering how big this world is, how many challenges we face, and how many opportunities. So as a result, before I left England, I went down to the British Embassy, our American Embassy rather, in Britain, and volunteered for the United States Navy. And they said, well, Mr. Lugar, you do seem to have a fine academic record, all things considered, but we really can't guarantee you'll get into OCS, Officer Candidate School. But mercifully, I was admitted and got my designation as an ensign and graduation, and then plucked out of obscurity to join Bob Inman there on the staff of Admiral Burke. A great mentor, And many of you have had those experiences already in terms of your intern situations. But today I want to take a view with you in a comprehensive way of American foreign policy, so-called challenges and opportunities, at least from one perspective. And then I hope in your questions and probing that there will be many perspectives that will illuminate the field even more. I would start with the thought, for example, that President Obama, in polling information in the press in the last 48 hours, has given an overall approval rating by the American public of only 38%. Many people believe that that downward trend has come because of Syria or problems attendant to foreign policy. But whatever the case, in terms of foreign policy, he does a little better, 40%. This is a whole lot better by sort of a multiple of 3 than the approval to Congress, 13%. It's an unusual situation in which the United States, as others look at us, with our own approval of our president at that rate and our Congress, and yet it's a time in which the president said in his speech at the UN, and I quote, U.S. plays an exceptional role on the world stage. The use of the word exceptional, it was not by chance, I'm certain. Those of you who followed the Syria episode at least about 10 days ago recall that Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, wrote a letter published in the New York Times which challenged the so-called idea of exceptionality of the United States. Well, the president is coming back and says we are exceptional. And I agree with that point of view, as a matter of fact. Any of you who have traveled abroad understand that the United States fleet alone really covers all of the high seas, as well as all of the routes for international trade. We keep it alive, literally, by our overall presence or our ability to be present wherever it may be. The ditto for the case with our ground troops. We're the only country really that has the ability to transport troops everywhere in the world and at fairly short notice. We've had allies in Afghanistan, for example, but frequently we had what I would call a taxi service. We picked up our NATO friends in their European countries and took them out there, brought them back, because most countries, as they have downgraded their defense budgets, do not have that transportability anymore, or have no pretensions of such comprehension. So that, on the basis of those two factors alone, makes for an exceptional nation. But having said that, we also have a problem in terms of our politics, which I've just alluded to, and it's not just simply the fact that members of Congress may be exceptionally partisan or the disputes may be bitter. It goes back really deeper to the last few years of time in which the American public has expressed, as the public frequently has. If you were to trace through the 19th century, I suppose, or even much of the 20th, and if the polling had been as comprehensive, the public would have been expressing what might be called isolationism. In essence, we do not really want to be involved in foreign wars, or, for that matter, in foreign affairs that might lead to conflict in which the United States might be involved. This has led, of course, to some terribly dramatic events when the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor, or on 9/11 in New York. On those occasions, why the public arises, whoever happens to be president suddenly has a constituency for the protection of America and American security, and maybe a whole lot more. And there have been other few occasions in which Americans were roused, but in this particular instance, we have had for several years, and I've not seen a poll this year or last year, but I recall just within the last 5 years, seeing some type of roll call, literally, of the Congress in which a majority of members praised the fact they did not have passports. And they were attempting to indicate that their attention was focused on the folks at home, not on gallivanting about abroad with all sorts of congressional sorties and so forth. It was almost to prove the point of their focus. Now, this has become even more pronounced with current membership in the Congress, especially in the House of Representatives, where a great number of members take the position that if they have town meetings or simply listen to their telephone calls or what have you, by a prohibitive majority, people are interested in the budget, in taxes, in spending, in excessive debt of the United States government, or as a part of that, what they believe is excessive control of American life by the federal government through regulations and so forth. And so therefore, these members claim that they were sent to Washington to correct this, and that this is their preoccupation and their total devotion. And as a result, you can talk if you're at the LBJ school or in the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate or what have you, until you're blue in the face about the rest of the world and about other problems, but you will be in a fairly small circle of people. This has led, in both cases of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, to perhaps fewer and fewer hearings that had to do with the exploration of foreign policy issues vis-a-vis other countries or regions of the world. Occasionally, hearings come up in which someone is accused of some malfunction. For example, probably the problems surrounding former Ambassador Chris Stevens in Libya are an example of this, in which a huge number of hearings have been held, in which the Republicans feel that Democrats necessarily sort of hid the traces during the last part of the Obama election and therefore never came clean, and State Department people still haven't been fired and this type of thing. But I really don't count these hearings exactly as an exploration or an idea in which policy is explored for the benefit of the American people through the media or through those who attend the hearings. And as a matter of fact, most members of the House take a position that they want to be there only 3 days a week, and they want 1 week out of 4 at home, once again, stressing the fact that the whole situation of governance is at home. It's with the issues that their constituents want, and they want them home. This leads even to the thought, although no population has been surveyed on this, that as many as 30 members of the House are living in their offices, so that they do not really have to even take a residence in terms of an apartment rental in Washington. So, now, this is an atmosphere in which our foreign policy arises presently, and it is one in which it is not a foregone conclusion. If you're president and you come before the Congress, as did our president within the last couple of weeks, the president, having made his red line statement that it was unacceptable to use chemical weapons in Syria, and now saying that we really needed to have a military strike to authenticate how valid at least that red line was. But then the president, supposedly after a walk around the White House lawn for a period of time, decided that the Congress needed to confirm that. It was an unfortunate sequence because right about that time, as you recall, the House of Commons turned down the British Prime Minister, indicating they did not want England participating with whatever President Obama had in mind. And very rapidly, polling started all over the United States, indicating by huge percentages the American public wanted no part of that. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I think to their credit, bravely came back from a recess. The House did not, but the Foreign Relations Committee had debate, actually had a vote by 10-7 with 1 abstention, decided to support the president, that is the committee. But it was very clear the Senate as a whole was not going to have a vote, and clearly it would be rejected with only about 25 members of the House identifying themselves in favor of this. Now, I mention this because these are the questions that are raised about the face of America to the world. How much confidence should we have in our president, in our Congress, in our word, in our ability, even on something as dire as chemical weapons? Many would say, well, it's not really that question at all. The president ought not to be drawing red lines. The president ought to be more careful in terms of his rhetoric, as indeed perhaps he should. Well, let's just discuss for a second. Foreign policy is more than simply red lines or the fact of whether the Congress responds, because all sorts of things occur all of the time, some without congressional votes, some that are going to require those in due course. Foreign policy includes trade agreements. It includes treaties. The trade agreements, by and large, don't require congressional scrutiny, although many times they receive that because particular groups in our society feel that they want a certain degree of protection. This may be true of labor unions, quite apart from corporations. But nevertheless, the United States has been a leader, by and large, in trying to extend foreign trade, and we still are. We're working with the Asian countries through the ASEAN group and through others to gain a much greater foothold in Asia with the approval of a lot of countries out there, as a matter of fact. But nevertheless, treaties usually do require congressional scrutiny, and important treaties, a two-thirds vote in the United States Senate. It is never the case, at least recently, that there were two-thirds votes from just one party if the parties were polarized in this situation. And as a matter of fact, it has been very difficult to get two-thirds majority for anything coming close on a treaty or any type of agreement. The last one being the conspicuous New START treaty. This brought about certain additional reductions of nuclear weapons promised by the United States and Russia. And it required a two-thirds vote just after the 2010 election, in which many Republicans said, you know, we won that election, and we don't want to have a debate before our new members get here. And furthermore, it's getting close to Christmas, and we want to go home and all the rest of it. And so essentially, getting enough votes across the line to get to the two-thirds was a situation that took days and days and days of continual debate and plotting, but it finally happened. The net result, however, was a promise that there would be no more arms control talks and treaties for a while, and with this particular Congress, I don't think there will be. In due course, because it's interesting that arms control have come up again, this time in the form of the chemical weapons. We'd be no closer to two-thirds now than we were then, but it's a serious issue. I remember very much the importance of Ronald Reagan asking 16 members of the Senate, 8 Democrats, 8 Republicans, to go to Geneva, Switzerland in 1986, first year in which there really was the probability of a treaty between the United States and Russia to begin any sort of reduction of nuclear weapons. It did not occur in 1986. Many senators were excited, so much so Ted Stevens of Alaska actually rented an apartment over there and was prepared to sort of stay the duration until the thing was signed. But after 5 years, nothing had been signed. But in the meanwhile, lots of things occurred in Russia, including the demise, really, of the regime. But still, it was the foresight of Reagan to know he was going to have to get bipartisan support to get a major arms control treaty, or for that matter, trade treaty, if there were objections from any particular group or industry in our country to a country involved or a particular part of that country. Now, likewise, there are from time to time, and these usually do not lead to congressional votes, but sometimes they do, economic sanctions. This is short of going into a country with so-called boots on the ground, but what we attempt to do is to confound what the transgressor, at least as we see it, is doing by bringing up banking problems or prohibiting imports or exports, as the case may be. In other words, attempting to inhibit their trade and their income coming from that respect. We have very active economic sanctions going on, which have great foreign policy implications with regard to the nuclear programs potentially in Iran and actually in North Korea presently. In Iran, many believe that the new overtures by Mr. Rouhani coming over to the UN and what have you have come because of a pragmatic feeling even by Khomeini, the great leader, that Iran is hurting, that the amount of money coming in from the normal oil exports, for example, and other vital trade has been hit so hard that whether the rest of the world knows about it or not, whether the data is complete, this has implications at the grassroots. Perhaps so, perhaps not. This is not evident in North Korea, and those sanctions have been there for quite a while, sometimes perhaps violated by others. The only negotiations we've had with North Korea came after some very successful banking sanctions in which the leaders were unable to bank their money in various countries and therefore came to the table quite apart from anybody else discussing it in North Korea. But economic sanctions are part of foreign policy. Ultimately, arms sales may be a part. As you may have noted in the press, in the last 48 hours, the United States has signed a treaty limiting arms sales, an international treaty. About 50 countries have signed this treaty, but I understand only about 6 have actually ratified the treaty. That has gone through the procedure we would have to with a 2/3 vote in the Senate. Already the National Rifle Association, I understand, is opposed to that treaty, and so this leads many to feel that its progress is unlikely, at least for a while, unless there is some further understanding of that position. But the thought is that all sorts of various arms would no longer be a part of international trade. That would mean likewise that countries that normally sell to each other, quite apart from supplying or giving it away, depending upon their foreign policy, would have to stop that. But that remains to be seen, sort of out there presently. Ultimately, of course, there is the problem of war itself. The war may take the form initially of airstrikes or strikes of naval craft, as opposed to so-called boots on the ground, actually armed forces landing. But nevertheless, it is an act of aggression against whatever country may be the target. And this leads, of course, to a good number of questions as to how a nation becomes involved in war, what steps are required. If you have, I suspect, a thoroughgoing dictatorship, then you really don't have too many questions of congressional approval or public approval or what have you. Perhaps the leader himself or herself has to determine at some point whether this is so far afield that this is likely to lead to a certain amount of revolt. But there are fewer questions, at least, raised under those sorts of circumstances. But in our country, we've had a curious situation over the course of time. Many have done a lot of scholarly work in the last month or so, trying to trace the numbers of times in which the United States has sent boots on the ground or taken acts of war. And did these require congressional debate? Was there approval? Was there even request for it? In recent years, the requests and the approvals have been declining. But one can point out whole periods of time in the 19th century in which the United States was declared almost isolationist, worrying about our own continent, and the questions really didn't arise at all. I mention all of this because, for example, in the current period of the Arab Spring situation, Tunisia happened, and it occurred so rapidly with the young man killing himself in the public square there, and people revolting, and the government suddenly disappeared and so forth, that there really wasn't a debate in our country, do we help out Tunisia? But it did lead very rapidly to a lot of flip statements. As you take a look at the geography across northern Africa, that Gaddafi must go, Assad must go over in Syria, Mubarak must go. In other words, that this was axiomatic if you had a feeling that these countries would be much better off if they had democracy, if they had human rights, judicial system, rights for women, and so forth. Absolutely apparent. After these brutal dictators had been there for 20, 30, 40 years, sort of the time had come, the spring had come. It was not at all obvious to all the people in these countries. And so despite our flip idea that they simply were going to topple one after another, we have been correct with regard to certainly Mubarak and Gaddafi. But, of course, the results have not been quite as anticipated. Leaving aside Tunisia, which sort of rumbles on, has problems getting the coalition government still operating satisfactorily and so forth. Small country, we don't read too much about it. Libya is a very small country, too, as a matter of fact. Maybe 6 to 8 million people, all told. It is apparent that security in Libya, security by that I mean even regular police functions in the civil state, quite apart from their foreign policy and so forth, is very negligible, so that even Libyan officials are not very secure. You get out as far as Benghazi, where our ambassador was killed, and there's very little security there, but there are a lot of contending groups of various types in Libya still contending for power. And you say, well, Gaddafi's gone. Well, that just simply meant an open season for competition for everybody else who has a particular cause. So this is not exactly an experiment in democracy thus far. Some of the people that I visit with who are in charge in Libya are people who were professors in the United States for the better part of 20 years, sort of waited it out over here. Went back because they were invited to help out, but did not exactly have a boots on the ground attitude with even their own countries. And in Egypt, you read a great deal about that because that's a big country, 80 million people. And Tahrir Square, Cairo, what have you, very conspicuous. Not so conspicuous, all the tens of millions of people in the hustings beyond the coastline in Cairo and so forth, where there are enormous problems of food and nutrition that were somehow held at bay by Mubarak through food subsidies, as was the case with most of the dictators, who sort of kept the peace with food securities or energy securities of some sort, subsidies, I mean, so that people were not starving and were not cold. But absent the export-imports, the tourists, the normal income, these folks don't have any money to have, and that is all they can do really to keep the lights on in these situations. So these are not exactly advertisements for democracy as yet. And in the case of Egypt, where we did have a democracy formulated, the United States very concerted in suggesting free and fair elections, even hoping to help organize through the National Democratic Institute and the comparable Republican group. But these folks were kicked out of the place. I remember visiting Latin America many, many times 30 years ago or so, under the auspices of monitoring elections, even helping out with ballot paper, counting, and all this sorts of things. But the Egyptians very quickly said, we don't want any of this. As a matter of fact, we'll run our own election, which they did. It was reasonably free and fair, pretty good turnout. But the only political party organized was the Muslim Brotherhood. And Morsi was obviously the president because they got a big majority vote. So this comes then to a certain anomaly when Morsi is displaced and people say, was this a military coup? Well, administration says not exactly, but we really don't want to define military coup exactly either. Well, of course it was a military coup, but the fact is we couldn't send any foreign aid to Egypt if it was defined as that. And in fact, we go back and forth in our own rhetoric about these situations. Now, if this were only the scope of warfare, that would be one thing. This is so-called conventional warfare. But now put into the perspective cyber warfare. One of the worst case scenarios that I've heard in some hearings, somebody who really is on a hacking spree and has a great deal of success with this technically might someday shut down our banking system for a while, or some vital sinews of commerce, not by sending troops over here or aircraft or firing ships and so forth. It's a different world, hooked as we are now on electronics and all those relationships. Well, my goodness, what consternation that would cause, and particularly if it hits our hospitals, if it hits other situations of our police departments and other aspects, and it's not exactly how you cure it very fast. That's warfare of a different sort altogether. It is brought to the fore, along with one other form of warfare, which is certainly less catastrophic for us thus far. We have been using drone aircraft. We've been using a lot of them in Afghanistan to go after al-Qaeda leadership, both in Afghanistan and in Pakistan beyond that, or in Yemen, or now in northern African countries. With superior intelligence that we've garnered by various means, we have found at least where these folks might be, sent the drone in and taken care of them. It didn't require an invasion or the risk of American forces losing their lives in the process. But now, think for a moment about these two situations. The whole drone business is brought to the fore, as have now some revelations by people who have deserted our intelligence services, so to speak, and revealed a whole lot of things. They have indicated that the United States has been monitoring telephone calls in block style, as they call it, all across the world. How many phone calls are coming from Russia to the United States or back and forth, and from whom and so forth. NSA would testify that they only get into the particulars of this if there's a specific case. And then they try to find out the phone number of the particular spy or whoever it is they're after and sort of track down who's calling and get some network of that sort. But that explanation has not been acceptable to most of the rest of the world. President Obama discovered that when the president of Brazil indicated that she was going to decline a White House invitation and the state dinner, only one the Obamas had planned for quite a while. And furthermore, she stood at the rostrum this week at the UN in the speech just before our president and ranted and raved about the cyber warfare going on with the United States vis-a-vis Brazil, almost as if her own phone calls were being listened to and so forth. Now, some people, so-called realists in politics, would say, well, now get real. This has been going on for quite a while with all sorts of countries, listening in to each other's messages and mail and so forth. Well, maybe so, maybe not. No one really knows how much. It's all sort of spilling out in various forms. And this gives some anxiety to many Americans who are not really certain in terms of their email accounts or other private messages they may have, quite apart from banking services, quite apart from classified intelligence, quite apart from everybody else around the world who believes that they are also under the gun. It's a different world, a different kind of warfare, potentially, with potentially awesome results coming from all of this. Now, one can make the case that we're all going to have to learn to live with all of this. So therefore, if you have some secrets or something nasty, don't put it in your email. You are bound to see it blossom up at some point, and that's going to be very bad news. But still, it's a different situation altogether when we discover foreign policy on this basis and countries being alienated because they feel there's been aggression electronically, not by troops, but by another nation, including us, that is the United States. Now, I would say as we began at the beginning with the president saying we're an exceptional nation, despite all that I've described, the fact is that there is, I believe, considerable dependence upon the world economy, upon the United Nations, all the political types and so forth, for the United States' strength. They want us, as a matter of fact, to have a solid dollar. And whatever may be our problems with the Chinese for many, many years, they continually buy many more billions of our bonds. They're putting at least their security money in the American Treasury bonds, as are a lot of other countries, as a matter of fact. That's pretty solid endorsement all by itself, despite all of the fright of many American members of either the administration or the Congress that somehow we are going bankrupt and sort of off the scope. We could, if we totally mismanage our affairs, if, for example, we don't raise the debt ceiling at some point so that we get bad news in terms of our ability to borrow at all. But we're going to hear then from our Social Security recipients, our Medicare recipients, our armed forces. All these people are not going to get paid. And so then there will be a reaction to that here, and perhaps that will solve our political problems, I hope, as we sort of come back to some stability again in all this. But still, the United States economy is strong. The dollar is strong. We still do have the Navy. We still do have the mobility. We still have, for example, as we're discussing, an entirely new concept in Asia, a so-called pivot strategy. They pivot from where? Well, the implication is we're coming out of Afghanistan, we've come out of Iraq, and we're going to spend more time with some of our troops going to Australia, for example, or with the ASEAN countries. I visited Japan, Indonesia, Thailand last year. Likewise, I came back through the Pacific Command, and very interesting. You know, we're now putting some more troops or contemplating this on Guam. We are sending large aircraft carriers around for maybe 6 months at a time. In the Manila Harbor, I went on board the USS Franklin Roosevelt, and there were a lot of people there from my home state of Indiana, down there in the hold, and had a good visit with all of them, of course. But up on the deck, you get some idea of how you shoot off an aircraft and how you catch one coming in. It's a very dramatic situation. But nevertheless, a happy one for most nations, seeing that carrier circling around there, as well as other counterparts. Now, the Chinese are not altogether happy about this. They have a feeling that somehow or other this is a way of influencing the problems in the so-called Senkaku Island dispute, islands between Japan and China that have been in dispute for decades, and in which the Japanese fear the Chinese want to occupy the islands. No one lives on them, but a whole lot of territorial integrity. Likewise, islands off the southern part of the Philippines, another object apparently of Chinese interest, which has worried the Philippines a lot. I noticed, at least with the governments of Japan and the Philippines, a much warmer cordiality with regard to American armed forces now and American visitors. Even thoughts about bases closed in the 90s in the Philippines maybe being opened again. In Indonesia, at least people delighted the United States paying some attention to this huge country and this long stretch. The Thailand people, a little more tentative, feeling they were sort of caught in the crosshatches here, not wanting to nod one way or the other, but sort of glad the United States is playing a role, at least in the process. Now, I don't know what will come of the pivot. Interesting enough, it was never explained to the Congress. Those who have been trying to find out about it have to sort of query the administration, and there are all sorts of interesting views, or they can visit the Pacific Command and ask the admirals and get a pretty good explanation out there. I get back to my first point that either the lack of interest by the Congress and the public in all of this, or the lack of interest in the administration in engaging the Congress and the public in all of this, is a severe problem for a country that is exceptional and it has all sorts of opportunities, but also has some problems in this respect. So what do we do about it? Well, those who are in the audience today hopefully will run for Congress. As a matter of fact, approach the whole subject in a different point of view. You'll actually want to visit other countries from time to time. Certainly you want to have a passport. Obviously, you would like to have hearings so you can invite guests from abroad as well as in the administration all the time, maybe one every day, as a matter of fact, so that you finally at least illuminate this whole thing. It becomes interesting for the American public again. I'll have to leave it up to each of you how you get elected, even more how you stay elected in the event you're going to do all of this. This is going to require a certain feeling on the part of the American people of change, that this is desirable. But these things are cyclical, I believe. There may come a time, and you really have to seize the opportunities and the preparation. So I salute you now for your studies, for your internships, for your thoughtfulness. I have just one more point of privilege of offering this opinion. I was asked by a distinguished reporter for the newspaper here at LBJ what points of advice that I would give as the things that are most essential. Well, let me have a go at that. I would say learn public speaking and do it every time you have a chance, either in terms of debate or public forum, even with an audience of 2 or 3, if you can gather them together. Practice your skills, practice the timing of making your arguments, how to phrase them and how to formulate the paragraphs and the conclusions and the reasons, Roman numeral 1, A, B, and so forth on down. And secondly, write for the school paper. See your words in print. Get criticism from your colleagues. See the implications of what that may mean. These are the elements of power, the elements of authority. You will have done your work as scholars. You will continue that because you're curious people all of your lives. But the ability to express and to lead through these elements is really a critical situation. So I hope that all of you are prepared. I wish you well. And at this point, I yield the floor and ask for your questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Senator Lugar. We will receive questions. I'll try to identify people. I'll try to keep track of whose hands I see first. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for your service to our country, Senator. I wanted to identify myself as a registered Republican who believes that Iraq and Afghanistan were unmitigated disasters. I think I know the answer to my question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Am I right to conclude that if the U.S. is still the indispensable country, we should prove it by avoiding any new military commitments?
Well, in answer to the second part of your question, I would say no, we should not make a pledge to avoid any military commitment. As a matter of fact, much of our influence comes at least from a calculation on the part of most countries that we do have a remarkable military and that there would be results, sometimes disastrous, by another country doing some untoward incident. So we certainly don't want to rule that out. However, as I've already indicated, other countries may already be calculating how likely it is that the United States would have this reaction, whether they made the pledge or not. Now, with regard to Afghanistan and Iraq, I believe that there have been changes over the course of the last decade in Iraq that were constructive, and that this is apparent on the streets of some of the larger cities in particular, where there's much greater commerce, more employment, more possibilities really for human progress. The dilemma in Iraq is very clearly the same dilemma that is a part of the Syrian problem and maybe other Middle Eastern situations. And that is that after the Ottoman Empire was broken up, after World War I, the Europeans, I suppose to the best of their ability, drew lines, boundaries of countries. They were not scholars as to how Shiites and Sunnis would live together or react and so forth. But we all know now much better about that. And the dilemma for Iraq is that you still have Sunni-Shiite rivalry and often violence, to the point that some weeks you see more people killed in Iraq than in Syria that particular month. That is horrible given 10 months or 10 years of American commitment. I remember Joe Biden, when he was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, I was ranking member because Republicans are a minority, and Joe had a hearing and in fact endorsed a plan to divide Iraq into a Sunni Iraq and a Shiite Iraq, with the thought that we would do a much better job than the Europeans had after the Ottoman Empire situation. Well, people said, my goodness, no, we're going to have free and fair elections. In fact, we're going to involve the Kurds. We're going to pass an oil law, so there's some money to pay for all of this. Well, the Kurds and the oil law are still somewhere at bay up there. The Shiites and the Sunnis still fighting in particular parts of the country. So it's not a pretty picture. But on the other hand, I think in fairness, there were constructive elements that occurred and are there. And so Afghanistan, I would say the same thing in comparison to where things stood in most parts of the country. But then the parts that are closest to Pakistan, others would say once again the European line drawing just was totally unsatisfactory for our purposes. We feel more kinship without the boundary, all the tribal situations that we have there. And so as a result, we, after 10 years, our situation is unsatisfactory. We don't know how the next election is going to come out or what sort of hold that government may have over the area, nor do the Pakistanis know, and they're worried about this because they see that land as a sort of a buffer against India, in which they have great difficulty. It's one of these situations in which, and I don't want to cause any further furor in my audience, but after we found out in Iraq that they didn't have nuclear weapons, you still had folks called the neocons, and they were not unique, but they were particularly articulate about it, that said there has to be a shining symbol out there of a Middle Eastern nation that understands democracy, that practices rule of law, that does the right things, because there isn't anything we can see out there right now. And Iraq is going to be the shining symbol and so forth. This led Democrats, when you got to the election finally, in which Barack Obama was elected the first time, I remember in a very bitter meeting in which I took part, saying, you Republicans, Iraq is your war. And if we're elected, we're ending that. And as a matter of fact, when the president had the first meeting with the congressional leadership after he was elected, he said, okay, now January the 1st or what have you of next year. Well, immediately the Democrats rose up and they said, Mr. President, the election was over now, out of there. That's the Republican war. Now, Afghanistan is our war. But now, of course, the president really did not have in mind either war in his election campaign originally, sort of stuck with both, has been moving along until finally we're trundling out of Afghanistan. But still, I think in certain parts of the country, certain improvements, and that would be my overall assessment.
Sam?
Senator Lugar, it's great to have you here. I'm a fellow Hoosier as well.
Good for you.
Moved to Texas last year for grad school, and I actually went to your symposium in 2007 when I was at the University of Indianapolis, so it's great to see you. My question has to do with the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program that you are involved in, as well as Senator Nunn. How would you assess that over the last 20 years, and what were the difficulties that you did see, and what do you think they will be in the future?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would love to give a sort of a book of answers on, but essentially, cooperative threat reduction occurred because Russians came to Sam Nunn and to me. We had been acquainted with them over the 5 years since the 1986 conference that didn't work out. We were members of that. And in essence, as I told a group earlier today, they met in Washington, and they said, we need your money, we need your technicians, we may need some of your armed forces, because we're bankrupt. Our soldiers are deserting. The guards that you thought were going to keep all of this stuff from somebody shooting at you are disappearing. Some of the stuff may be disappearing. Now, this is a total bypass of general history in which a great superpower, after 40 years of so-called mutually assured destruction, comes and talks to two senators and says, you know, we need your money and we're going to bail out of this thing. So very quickly, Sam and I had to conjure up a majority in the last few days of the 1991 session. The House, thank goodness, just passed it. They wanted to go home, I guess. And the administration, however, didn't know what in the world to do with this. After all, presidents are the commander-in-chief. These are the people formulating this, and they certainly had no part of the non-Lugar business. So this took quite a while for us to persuade them. As a matter of fact, we were still doing so through the last year of George Bush's administration. But the Clinton group were more congenial, and by and large, we got going in a bigger way. Now, the net effect of it has been, let me just say, as mayor of Indianapolis for 8 years, I was totally unaware of what might have happened to my city. I became aware one time when I went down into one of the silos in which a large missile had been contained. It had 8 nuclear warheads independently on it. And on the 13th floor of the silo, there was the guard station where these people had been at the shoot in readiness for all these years. And around in the walls were large pictures, beautiful pictures of American cities. This led me, I looked for Indianapolis to see whether we were in the gun side of that particular one. But I found, as most of you are scholars of this, that every American city of any size was targeted. All of our military installations. They had at least 13,000 warheads, and they may have had more. Any 1 or 2 of those that hit Indianapolis would have leveled the entire city and the entire population, whether I knew about it or not as mayor. These are the consequences. Tom Clancy wrote about the submarine that went up and down the Atlantic coast in Hunt for Red October. When I went out to Sevmash, and I was invited there by Russians. I just happened to be in the country, and this was a part of the non-Lugar business. That unexpected trips occurred. And I went out there, and there were 6 of those submarines. The Russians had decided they wanted to finally destroy them. They each had 200 missiles on them. So for the better part of 20 years, these went up and down our eastern coast, just a chip shot into Philadelphia or New York or what have you, whether we knew about it or not. Well, these are the consequences of all of this. Now, the threat reduction situation led to inspections both ways. The treaties led to a mutual destruction on our part and the Russians. We had to pay for much of the Russian destruction, even to the point that we have built a very large facility at Sucha out in Siberia. Because Sam and I found on one of our trips out in warehouses all sorts of cartridges containing nerve gas, tens of thousands of them on shelves like a sporting goods situation. And so as a result, we've been destroying those. The Russians are through about 70% by some estimates of their chemical weapons. We've gotten through about 80% of ours. The Treaty of the Chemical Weapons Convention says we should have finished it off by 2012, but that's been physically impossible. We're still at it in 3 installations in the United States. But just think for a moment. I picked up one of these shells. A Russian put a hat on me, and they took a picture of this thing, which appeared all over Russia. But it led to a lot of conversation. Well, what would this happen if one of those shells had come into this great football stadium here at the University of Texas? The prediction by the Russians is if it had hit right, it would have annihilated everybody in the stands. That would have been true of any large congregation of people at any one time. That was the danger we faced, and whether we knew about it or not. This is what mutually assured destruction was all about. Now, we are beyond that point, thank goodness. We're working our way down through the last of the inventory and trying to influence other countries not to build up any more inventory in a dangerous world.
I think we have time for just one more question. Jeremy, sorry.
Thank you again. Thank you again, Senator, for being here. It's really wonderful. I wanted to ask you, in your long, distinguished career, who was the most effective Democratic president you worked with, and why?
I believe that President Clinton was the most effective, in large part, I think, because he really worked at being effective. Bill Clinton was the sort of person that if you went into a conference and it was apparent to him that you didn't agree, he would almost chase you around the room before you could get out, trying to persuade you that this was really the way that it was and so forth. And a lot of that's required in politics. It's sort of messy and what have you, but I like to think I'm president. After all, people ought to pay some respect. I'm commander-in-chief and all the rest of it, but here are all these young people that just don't know any better, and we've got to attend to them. But this leads me to believe that on balance, he had his problems, obviously, but at the same time, during that period of time, I think was effective. And more so than I did not have that many opportunities to work with President Carter, many more with his wife Rosalind, because she'd been very much involved with children in Atlanta who were looking for educational reform and what have you. And this was much on my mind, having been a school board member. So we had some ties. So I saw the president back and forth. With President Obama, we've had a very good relationship. When he was a freshman senator, he asked me if he could go with me to Russia the first year that he was in the Senate. He said, I know you go over there every year, Dick. And I said, well, I'd be very pleased. So we went to Russia, Ukraine, and Azerbaijan on that particular trip. I had the experience of being detained, not incarcerated, but we'll say detained in Perm, which is out in the middle of the country, because I have no idea why Russians wanted to get onto our aircraft. The young people who guard the aircraft were holding them off, thank goodness. We had a wonderful celebration with Russians because we'd been destroying weapons out in some place near Perm, and suddenly we found we were not going to go anywhere. And I just told Barack to take a nap, and there's nothing going to happen for a while. They finally let us go, but it was quite an eventful trip for sort of initiation for a young senator coming along there. But I would just say simply that we've had a good relationship really throughout. But at the same time, I've not always been persuasive with the Libyan situation. Without telling tales out of school unduly, Barack Obama called a meeting of 6 congressional leaders, 6 members of the cabinet, and so I had the temerity to say, what really is the national interest of the United States in becoming involved with Libya? Now, I could see the national interest of the French and the Italians. They had stepped forward. Out of our NATO allies, the Germans had stepped aside, and so had most of the rest. Well, he said that's not the question. He said the question is the Gaddafi force are going to go door to door and shoot people. It's a question of humanity and saving lives. So he said no boots on the ground, absolutely no boots on the ground. He didn't say we'll lead from behind, but he said we will sort of refuel in the aircraft from our NATO allies. Now, eventually, we did a lot more. We sent a lot of arms there, which we're still trying to chase down in parts of Africa, and became involved in other ways. But in any event, just to pick up the general foreign policy question a little further, at some point, the Foreign Relations Committee did have the temerity to say, well, now, doesn't the War Powers Act cut in? Well, those of you who haven't dealt with War Powers Act, this came about because presidents have had a habit, and Democrat and Republican administrations, of going to war without having anybody confirming it. Well, the Obama people sent over people and said, no, it doesn't apply at all. It doesn't make any difference. And essentially, Democratic members sort of let it go. Ultimately, we spent $1 billion, although the president assured it would all be over and not very much expense. And in fairness, there were no boots on the ground, but a sort of a mess, as I've related.
Well, let me thank you, Senator Lugar, for your remarks. And I was telling you earlier how passionately we care about public service in this school and how we're also, all of us, I think, disheartened by what we see in Washington. So we need, in addition to some wise remarks, we need an example to look up to. And you in your long career have always been that kind of example to generations of public service, including this generation. So we thank you for that as well.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.